Welcome to Top 10 Secret, where the most haunting ghost stories are revealed. Do you dare step into a world of terrifying mysteries, where ghost stories don't just give you chills but haunt your mind forever? At Top 10 Secret, we bring you eerie supernatural encounters, shadowy figures lurking in the night, deadly curses, and unexplained disappearances. Each video takes you deep into the darkest corners of the unknown, where reality and nightmares blur together. Are you ready to face your fears? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss the most haunting horror stories. Story 1. Have you ever been lost in a dense forest when night falls? Imagine stumbling upon an abandoned wooden cabin, thinking it's a safe shelter. But then, things start to get strange. Don't miss this chilling story. If you find it interesting, hit like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next stories. Mysterious deep forest. The night fell, swallowing everything in thick darkness. The forest became eerily silent, with only the rustling of leaves breaking the stillness as a light breeze passed through. Amidst this vast emptiness, a lone hunter trudged forward, his breath heavy, heart pounding. He had spent the entire day tracking his prey, only to find himself lost. Now deep in the woods with no sign of human presence, he was surrounded only by the endless shadows. With no sense of direction, he relied on instinct, hoping to find a way out. But the further he walked, the denser the forest became. The branches intertwined like grasping hands, blocking the faint moonlight. Every step on the dry leaves echoed in the silence, making him feel as if someone was following him. Yet each time he turned around, he saw nothing but the abyss of darkness. Fear crept into his mind. No one knew he was here. No one could help him if something happened. He tried to stay calm, but exhaustion weighed down his legs. His eyes strained to scan the surroundings, desperately searching for shelter until dawn. And then, as if fate had intervened, he spotted a small wooden cabin standing in a clearing. His heart tightened. The cabin looked old and abandoned, its wooden walls gray with age. The windows were pitch black, no light, no sign of life. But in the cold, desolate forest, it was his only hope. He hesitated at the door, an unshakable feeling warning him that something was wrong. But exhaustion dulled his instincts. He reached out and pushed the door. It wasn't locked. Inside, the air was cold and damp. The room was nearly empty, containing only an old bed, a wooden table covered in dust, and a fireplace long forgotten. A sense of unease settled over him, but he reassured himself. It was just an abandoned cabin. He needed rest. Closing the door gently, he set his backpack down and moved toward the bed. But then, a strange sensation washed over him. It felt as though someone was watching. He lifted his gaze, and his breath caught. The walls were covered with portraits. Each one depicted distorted faces, pale skin, and wide, hollow eyes that seemed to follow his every move. His throat went dry. There was something unsettling about those gazes, something unnatural. He blinked, shifting his focus to another painting, only to find the same eerie stare. It was as if they were alive, silently observing him. A shiver ran down his spine. He forced himself to dismiss the thought, telling himself it was just exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. They were just paintings, nothing more. Ignoring the creeping dread, he hurried to the bed, pulling the worn blanket over himself. Turning to face the wall, he shut his eyes, willing himself to sleep. But even with his eyes closed, he could feel their presence. The wind howled through the cracks, carrying a whisper-like sound. Was it just the wind, or something else? He shuddered, pulling the blanket tighter. The cabin felt colder than before. Time passed, and exhaustion finally claimed him. He drifted into an uneasy sleep, though a lingering sense of dread refused to fade. And then, as the first rays of morning light seeped through the cracks, a horrifying realization struck him. The portraits were gone. In their place were nothing but empty window frames. And outside, the dark forest watched in silence. Stepping into the old wooden cabin, the hunter carefully shut the door behind him, trying not to make a sound. Outside, the night still loomed, the cold wind whistling through the cracks, carrying the damp chill that seeped into his bones. He stood still for a moment, listening, but there was nothing. Only the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his chest. The room was swallowed in darkness, with only a faint glimmer of moonlight slipping through the dusty window slats. The silence was so deep that he could hear his own breathing echo in the confined space. A musty odor filled the air, mingling with the scent of rotting wood, making him wrinkle his nose. Even so, he had no other choice. Outside was the cold, unforgiving forest, and he knew wandering in the darkness would be far more dangerous. He stepped forward cautiously, his eyes adjusting to the dim light, taking in his surroundings. The room was nearly empty, just an old bed with a tattered blanket, a scratched wooden table, and a fireplace long devoid of warmth. There were no signs of recent habitation, and yet, something felt off. The room wasn't as dusty as one would expect from an abandoned cabin. It was as if someone had been here recently. Or perhaps they were still here, lurking somewhere in the shadows. A chill crept down his spine. He scanned the room, his hands clenching instinctively as if to steady himself. A growing unease gnawed at the edges of his mind, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was just an empty cabin, he told himself. Whoever once owned it must have long since left. He set his backpack down on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed. Exhaustion weighed on him, his body aching from the long journey. He only needed a few hours of rest. By morning, he would leave. But before allowing himself to sleep, he decided to examine the room more carefully, just to make sure there was nothing dangerous. And that was when he noticed something that sent a shiver through his bones. The walls weren't bare as he had first assumed. They were covered in portraits. Or at least, that's what they seemed to be at first glance. His gaze traveled over each one. Every portrait was different, yet they all shared the same unsettling feature. The eyes. Wide, hollow, and unblinking, they stared straight ahead, empty, yet eerily alive. The faces in the paintings were distorted, their pale skin nearly translucent, their expressions twisted as if silently screaming. A wave of unease tightened around his chest. He swallowed hard, telling himself they were just paintings, nothing more. And yet, he couldn't look away. He forced himself to close his eyes, taking a slow, steady breath. But when he opened them again, the unease only deepened, because now he was certain the eyes had shifted. Before, they had simply gazed into the void. But now, they were looking directly at him. His grip tightened on the edge of the bed, his pulse hammering against his ribs. "It's just my imagination," he muttered under his breath. But the fear had already begun to take hold, creeping into every corner of his mind. Unable to bear it any longer, he sprang to his feet, stepping back. And in that moment, he saw something even more horrifying, his reflection in the glass of one of the portraits. But the thing reflected back at him wasn't quite him. His reflection was distorted, warped, as if something was standing behind him, blending into the shadows. Something, or someone, was there. His heart nearly stopped. He spun around, his breath caught in his throat. But behind him, there was nothing, just the empty wall. Yet when he turned back to the portrait, the distorted reflection remained, and this time, it moved. A cold dread surged through his veins. The room suddenly felt smaller, heavier, the air thick with an unseen presence. His breath came in shallow gasps, every nerve in his body screaming at him to run. But his legs wouldn't move. They were frozen in place, as if something was holding him there. Then, a sound echoed from the far corner of the room. A soft creak of wood, like the weight of a footstep. That was it. He couldn't take it anymore. He lunged for the bed, yanking the blanket over his head, forcing his eyes shut. He didn't dare look, didn't dare breathe too loudly. If he just kept his eyes closed, everything would be fine. Right? Lying there, he listened to the frantic pounding of his own heart. But no matter how tightly he shut his eyes, he could still feel it. Those unseen eyes, watching him from every corner of the cold, silent room. The air inside the wooden cabin was stiflingly still. The hunter sat frozen on the edge of the bed, his entire body tense, his breaths coming in short, uneven gasps. He had tried to convince himself that this was just an abandoned house, nothing more. But what he was seeing now sent waves of fear crashing over him, an uncontrollable, relentless tide. Lining the walls, rows of portraits hung side by side, each face pale, hollow-eyed, and staring down at him. At first, he thought they were just old paintings, but the longer he looked, the more unease crept into his bones. Those eyes weren't merely lifeless. They had something disturbingly vivid about them, as if they were tracking his every movement. He swallowed dryly, forcing himself to look away, but the sensation of being watched didn't fade. It slithered beneath his skin, crawling up his spine, making the hairs on his arms stand on end. The faces in the paintings were strangely distorted, some twisted in silent screams, while others curled their lips into sinister, knowing smirks. But the most terrifying thing of all was their gaze, piercing, endless, as if trying to consume him whole. The air in the room grew heavier, pressing down on his chest. A chill, unseen but palpable, seeped into every crevice, wrapping around him like an invisible shroud. He reached out hesitantly, his fingertips brushing against the nearest portrait. The rough texture of old canvas was what he expected to feel. But what he felt instead was cold, clammy skin. He jerked his hand away, his heart pounding wildly. This couldn't be real. It had to be exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. But then, something impossible happened. The eyes in the painting shifted. He stood paralyzed, his back hitting the wall. He watched in horror as the eyes in the painting narrowed slightly, then slowly moved, following his movements. His throat tightened, his breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts, his limbs trembling so badly he could barely stand. The room suddenly felt suffocating, the darkness in the corners thickening, spreading, swallowing up what little light remained. He could feel it now. Something was here, something unseen, but not unfamiliar. Then, from behind him, a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." He froze, every muscle locked in place. A breath, cold as mist, brushed against the nape of his neck. He didn't want to turn around. He couldn't. But the terror in his veins forced him to. Slowly, he turned. Nothing. But when he whipped his head back around, what he saw made his blood run cold. All the portraits had changed. Before, they were eerie but distorted. Now, they were identical. And the face in every single one was his. His heart slammed against his ribs. Every pair of eyes in the paintings, every single face, was his own, but warped, grotesque, twisted into expressions that defied human nature. Some wore wicked, unnatural grins. Others had their mouths open in silent, anguished screams. This was no ordinary abandoned house. This place was cursed. It didn't belong to this world. Panic surged through him like wildfire. He lunged for the door, his shaking hands fumbling for the handle. He twisted it violently, yanking, pounding his fist against the wood, desperate to escape. The door didn't budge. Behind him, the whispers began again. But this time, they weren't just one voice. A chorus of murmurs filled the room, overlapping in an unsettling cacophony. One deep and guttural, another faint and breathy. A third, a high-pitched giggle that sent a chill through his spine. Unable to take it any longer, he backed into the corner, gripping his backpack like a lifeline, as if it could shield him from whatever was creeping closer. Then, all at once, the voices stopped. The silence was deafening. He held his breath, and in that instant, from the largest painting in the center of the room, a skeletal, deathly pale hand reached out, stretching down toward him. A scream tore from his throat. He squeezed his eyes shut, refusing to look. And then, everything went black. The hunter jolted upright from the bed, cold sweat trickling down his spine despite the icy air in the room. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart pounding violently as if trying to burst free from his chest. The whispers had vanished, yet the unsettling feeling of being watched refused to fade. His eyes darted around the dimly lit room. Everything appeared unchanged. But was it really? The portraits still hung on the walls, their hollow eyes locked onto him. But this time, they weren't just staring. There was something different. The painting directly in front of him. Its face had changed. Pale skin, cracked lips, but the most terrifying thing was the eyes. They were no longer mere brushstrokes on canvas. They blinked. He recoiled instinctively, his back slamming against the wall. Number that was impossible. It was just a lifeless painting. It couldn't have blinked. But as he stared, the lips in the portrait began to move, forming silent words. No sound came from them, yet he could read them clearly. You cannot escape. His entire body locked up, his breath hitching in his throat. No, this wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But what happened next was even worse. The painting beside it also began to shift. A shadowy hand stretched out from the darkness within the frame, its long, skeletal fingers clawing at the edges, its sharp nails scraping against the wood. A slow, grating sound echoed through the stillness, slicing through his eardrums like 100 tiny blades. Not just one, all of them. Every painting in the room was now moving. Crooked mouths twisted into silent curses. Shadowy hands reached out, groping at the air, waiting for him to let his guard down, to seize him, to pull him into an endless void. He spun around, bolting for the door, his trembling hands fumbling at the lock. The handle rattled, but the door wouldn't open. He threw his full weight against it, pounding his fists, but it remained shut, as if an unseen force had sealed it shut. A cold gust brushed against his nape. Not from the window, not from outside, from behind him. He didn't want to turn around. He knew that if he did, he would see something far worse than he could ever imagine. But his instincts screamed that he had no choice. Slowly, as if guided by an unseen force, he turned. The paintings were no longer paintings. The grotesque faces had emerged from their frames, floating in the air, their empty eyes still fixed on him. A cracked, jagged mouth whispered in a raspy voice, "Stay with us." A scream tore from his throat, shattering the suffocating silence. And then, everything collapsed into darkness. He didn't know when he lost consciousness, or rather, when he was lost to unconsciousness. When he opened his eyes, the room was still and quiet once more. No faces crawling out of the paintings, no whispers, no cold breath on his skin. He shot upright, his heart still hammering. Was it real, or was it just a nightmare? But what unsettled him most was not the eerie stillness. It was the walls. The paintings were gone. In their place were empty windows, gaping, pitch-black voids. Windows? But this house had never had windows. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped forward, his pulse thundering in his ears. He approached one of the openings, peering into the dense, inky blackness beyond. No forest, no moonlight, only a vast, endless void. And in that darkness, eyes, dozens, hundreds. Open wide, glowing faintly as they stared directly at him. He stumbled back, his limbs trembling. No, this isn't real. But before he could run, a hand shot out from the darkness, cold, dry, yet impossibly strong, gripping his wrist. A chilling voice rang out, no longer a whisper. "You have seen us. You cannot leave." He thrashed wildly, desperate to break free, but the grip only tightened. More hands emerged from the black void, skeletal fingers wrapping around him, dragging him toward the abyss. He let out one final desperate scream, but no one heard. The darkness swallowed him whole. The morning air remained eerily cold. The hunter jolted awake, his eyes wide open, chest rising and falling in frantic breaths. The horrifying images from the night before still haunted his mind. The lifelike portraits, the ghostly whispers, the hands reaching out from the darkness. But now, everything was gone. He exhaled sharply, trying to steady himself. Maybe it had all just been a nightmare. Exhaustion from a long day of hunting in the forest, combined with the cold and loneliness, must have played tricks on his mind. Stretching, he rubbed his eyes and glanced around the room. Then suddenly, his body went rigid. The portraits, where were they? Last night, he remembered clearly. Every wall had been covered with unsettling portraits, their eerie eyes following him. But now, there was nothing. Only bare, dusty walls, aged with time. Not a single painting remained. A chill ran down his spine. Could it be that everything had been real? He swallowed hard, trying to piece together his memories. But the more he recalled, the more unsettled he became. Grabbing his backpack, he made a decision. He couldn't stay here any longer. He rushed to the door, twisting the handle. This time, it opened easily. No invisible force holding it shut like before. Morning light spilled in, washing away the suffocating gloom of the house. Stepping outside, he took a deep breath. The crisp air helped clear his mind, but as he turned back to look at the house, an uneasy feeling crept over him. The house looked too ordinary. There were no signs that anything horrifying had occurred the night before, but the sense of dread refused to leave him. His feet stopped in front of what should have been a large window. He remembered it vividly. Last night, in his final moments before losing consciousness, he had seen those dark windows filled with countless staring eyes. But now, what he saw sent a fresh wave of horror crashing over him. The house had no windows. His chest tightened. How was that possible? He had seen them. He remembered them. Those pitch-black frames, those glowing eyes watching him. Yet now, before him, stood a solid wooden wall, thick and seamless, with no openings at all. His legs felt weak. If the house never had windows, then what had he seen last night? A shiver crawled up his spine. He didn't want to know. It was time to leave. He turned and sprinted into the forest, wanting to get as far away as possible. The leaves rustled beneath his feet. Birds chirped overhead, but his mind was consumed by sheer panic. He had to forget everything. He had to pretend he had never set foot in that cursed place. But then, a cold breeze swept across the back of his neck. He froze. The sensation, it was familiar. Slowly, hesitantly, he turned to look at the house one last time. The door was still open. But now, within the darkness beyond the threshold, he saw a figure standing there. A man, tall and gaunt, skin pale as death, eyes empty, staring directly at him. A distorted smile stretched across his face. The hunter felt his heart stop. The man was him. A twisted, hollow version of himself stood in the doorway, the grin growing wider, eyes as black as an abyss. Terror surged through him. He turned and ran, his pulse hammering, his breath ragged. He didn't dare look back, but no matter how fast he ran, the sound followed him. Footsteps. And in the whispering wind, a voice murmured softly, "You belong to this place now." The words echoed, following him forever. Story 2. Have you ever wondered if the world you see is really all there is? Today's story will make you think twice. Don't forget to leave a comment, like the video, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next mystery. Haunted glasses. I never thought the world I saw could change just because of a pair of glasses. When the doctor told me there was something wrong with my eyes, I didn't think much of it. My parents didn't take it seriously either. They thought I could see well enough. But then the doctor said something that stuck with me. "You might not realize it, but your eyes are missing more than you think." That sentence echoed in my mind as I put on the glasses for the first time. Everything was unnervingly sharp. I could see the fine details of the wall across from me, the leaves swaying outside the window, even the tiny letters on a billboard down the street. A strange feeling crept over me, like the world had never been complete until now. But that was just the beginning. At first, everything seemed normal. I assumed I was just getting used to my new vision. But then I started noticing strange things. At first, it was just fleeting shadows at the edge of my vision. I'd turned to look, but there was nothing there. Probably just my imagination, I told myself. But as night fell, those shadows became clearer. They weren't just shadows. They had shapes. They moved. I started seeing them in places no one else seemed to notice. In the corners of my room where the light didn't reach. In the dim parking lot as I walked past. They never moved when I looked directly at them, but I could feel their gaze. The first time I truly realized what was happening, I couldn't breathe. Had they always been there? One night, I decided to test it. I took my glasses off, and the world went back to normal. The shadows disappeared. Nothing was there, just my ordinary room, blank walls, and the soft glow of my night lamp. I put my glasses back on, my heart pounding as I glanced toward the corner. They were still there. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But it was hard to believe that when, every time I glanced around, I could still see them. Silent, unmoving, watching. I don't know what they are. I don't know if I'm the only one who can see them. But there's one thing I do know. I've opened my eyes to a world I was never meant to see. The next morning, I put my glasses away in a drawer. I didn't want to see the truth anymore. Some things are better left blurry. The secret behind the glasses. At first, I thought wearing glasses would simply help me see things more clearly. License plates, small letters on signs, or the face of someone standing at the end of the street. A simple change, nothing worth thinking about. But I was wrong. Very wrong. The first few days passed normally. I adapted quickly to my new vision and even felt excited to see everything in sharper detail than ever before. No more squinting, no more blurry outlines. Everything looked like it had been redrawn with crisp, precise lines. But then, slowly, an unsettling feeling crept into my mind. Something wasn't right. At first, I couldn't pinpoint what it was. I just felt uneasy, like there was always something lurking at the edge of my vision. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. Then the shadows began to appear. They weren't clear, just vague shapes flickering at the corners of my sight. At first, I dismissed them as tricks of my adjusting eyesight. But soon, I realized those shadows weren't staying in one place. They were moving. On my way home, I saw a figure standing silently on the sidewalk. His face was hidden beneath a worn-out hood, but I could feel his gaze, cold and piercing, locked onto me. A chill ran down my spine, and I quickly looked away. When I glanced back, he was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination. I tried to convince myself that nothing was out of the ordinary, but the more I saw, the harder it was to ignore. In class, I noticed someone sitting at the very back row. A figure dressed in gray, head bowed, completely still. No one else in the room seemed to acknowledge him. My throat went dry, and I forced myself to look away. But the sensation of being watched made my skin crawl. The bell rang. Students stood up, chatting and gathering their things, but I remained frozen in my seat. Slowly, I glanced toward the back of the room. The chair was empty. My palms turned ice cold, sweat beading on my forehead despite the room's steady temperature. I shut my eyes, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But when I opened them, my heart nearly stopped. He was standing right in front of me. A scream caught in my throat. I stumbled back, almost tripping over my own feet. But the moment I blinked, he was gone. I gasped for breath, struggling to steady my racing heartbeat. I couldn't go on like this. I needed to know the truth. The moment I got home, I rushed into my room, slammed the door shut, and stood in front of the mirror. Taking a deep breath, I slowly removed my glasses. Everything disappeared. No more lingering shadows. No more eerie presence. My room was normal again. Silent, still, safe. With my pulse hammering in my ears, I hesitated before slipping the glasses back on. And they were there. Dozens of them. Faint, featureless figures, standing quietly right behind me. I ripped the glasses off and threw them to the ground. No, this can't be real. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I pressed my hands against my face, trying to calm down. But I couldn't bring myself to pick up the glasses again, because I had just realized a horrifying truth. The glasses didn't just help me see this world more clearly. They showed me a world I was never meant to see. What lurks in the dark? At first, I thought I was imagining things. Shadows flickering at the edge of my vision, strange figures appearing for a split second before vanishing. But soon, they were no longer just illusions. They were real. With each passing day, I saw them more and more. Not just in the dark corners of my room or in empty parking lots, but out on the streets, in my classroom, even in the middle of crowded places. They were not human. Their forms were twisted, distorted, like they didn't belong to this world. Some were unnaturally tall, their elongated limbs resembling gnarled branches. Others were hunched over, shuffling with slow, dragging steps that sent chills down my spine. But no matter how different they looked, they all had one thing in common. They had no faces. I didn't know what they were, but one thing was certain. They saw me. I could feel their invisible gaze. They never moved closer, never tried to harm me. They just stood there, watching, waiting. Waiting for what? I didn't want to find out. One night, as I lay in bed, I decided to test something. I shut my eyes, counted a few seconds, then snapped them open. And I saw it. A shadow stood in the corner of my room, silently watching me. It didn't move. It made no sound. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. I blinked. It was closer. My breath caught in my throat. I forced myself to keep my eyes open, but they began to burn. My heartbeat pounded against my ribs, erratic and wild. I blinked again. It was right beside my bed. A scream tore from my throat as I bolted upright, yanking my glasses off my face. And just like that, everything was gone. No shadow, no figure. Only my familiar desk, my chair, and my half-open closet. I clutched my chest, struggling to steady my breath, my back soaked in cold sweat. I never put my glasses on again. But that wasn't the worst part. The next morning, as I stepped outside, I looked up at the sky and froze. They were there, scattered across the rooftops, dozens of faceless shadows standing shoulder to shoulder, motionless, staring down at the city below. No one else seemed to notice them. I took a step back, my breathing sharp and uneven. My entire body went numb with fear. I had seen a world I was never meant to see. And now, I knew. They had seen me too. The horrifying truth, I had never seen them before. Before I wore glasses, my world was just a string of ordinary days. Bustling streets, boring classrooms, and a familiar bedroom with harmless dark corners. I had never felt like something was wrong, never felt watched, never seen them. But just a few days after putting on the glasses, the world I once knew had completely changed. Now I couldn't go anywhere without spotting them lurking in the hidden corners of the city. In classrooms, in coffee shops, on sidewalks, in parking lots. They stood there, silent and unmoving, like shadows trapped between two worlds. I began to wonder, had they always been there? Am I really the only one who can see them? I didn't dare ask anyone else. Who would believe something this insane? If I said it out loud, would they think I was delusional? But my fear grew with each passing day. These nameless creatures were no longer just standing still. They had started to move. That night, I sat in my room trying to ignore the terrifying thoughts clawing at my mind. But then, I felt it. A cold draft brushing against the back of my neck. I froze. A strange sensation spread through my body. A primal instinct screaming at me that something was standing right behind me. I swallowed hard, my trembling fingers gripping the edge of my desk. I didn't want to turn around. I couldn't turn around. But then curiosity, dark, twisted curiosity, overpowered my reason. Slowly, I turned my head, and I saw it. A tall, gaunt figure, its bones protruding as if its skin was just a thin, fragile covering. It stood in the corner of my room. No eyes, no mouth, just a hollow, featureless head covered in ashen gray flesh. It didn't move, but I knew it was watching me. A scream tore from my throat as I ripped the glasses from my face and threw them to the floor. And then, it was gone. Nothing in the room. No one in the corner. Only the sound of my heart hammering wildly in my chest. I gasped for air, cold sweat soaking through my clothes. I couldn't deny the truth any longer. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't hallucinating. They were real. But why had I never seen them before? The answer was painfully clear. Because I had never worn glasses. Before I saw them, I lived in a quiet world. One where darkness was just darkness, and hidden corners held nothing to fear. But now that the light had exposed the horrifying truth, I realized they had always been there, watching me. I had just never noticed before. The final choice. I know I'm not seeing the truth. I know that when I take off the glasses, everything will go back to the way it was. No more shadows lingering in the corners. No more grotesque figures on the sidewalks. No more invisible eyes watching me. The world will be normal again. Quiet. Safe. But I also know that's just an illusion. Reality hasn't changed. I'm just choosing not to see it. Today, I decided to try one last time. I stood in an empty parking lot at dusk, glasses on, heart pounding as I looked around. The wind brushed through my hair, but that wasn't what made me shiver. They were everywhere, leaning against crumbling walls, standing in rows beneath the dim streetlights. perched atop buildings, peering down in eerie silence. My chest tightened. I knew they saw me. I knew they realized that I could see them. Then, one of them moved. I froze. That tall, distorted figure, the one that had been motionless all this time, now took a step toward me. Its movements were unnatural, like its body wasn't meant to move. Each step dragged across the pavement with a dry, scraping sound. Its joints creaked and popped, as if they were breaking apart with every motion. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But my body was paralyzed by sheer terror. Then another one moved, and another. They weren't standing still anymore. They were coming for me. With every ounce of strength I had left, I tore the glasses from my face. Everything disappeared. The parking lot was empty. No twisted figures, no unnatural movements. Just rows of parked cars and the dull glow of streetlights reflecting on the pavement. I staggered back, gasping for air. I wanted to believe it had all been in my head. I wanted to believe I had imagined everything. But I knew the truth. I knew they were still there. I just couldn't see them anymore. Now I sit in my room, staring at the glasses on my desk. They lie there, harmless. Yet I know that if I put them on again, I'll see things I was never meant to see. I have a choice. I can continue living in the world I used to know, where dark corners are just dark corners, where I no longer have to fear stepping outside. Or I can accept reality, see the world for what it truly is. A place where unseen things exist all around us, watching, waiting for something I don't even want to imagine. I know what I have to do. I pick up the glasses, turning them over in my hands. Then, without hesitation, I throw them into the trash. I will never wear them again. I will live as I did before. I will pretend I never saw anything at all. And I can only hope that if I can't see them anymore, they can't see me either. The inescapable truth. I thought that if I threw away the glasses, everything would end. That I could go back to my normal life, to a world where the horrors I had seen never existed. But I was wrong. So very wrong. In the first few days after abandoning the glasses, I tried to convince myself that it had all been a hallucination. I forced myself to believe that everything I had seen was just a trick of my imagination. But then, I realized something terrifying. Though I no longer wore the glasses, I could still feel them. Whenever I walked down the street, I felt invisible eyes following me. Whenever I was alone in my room, the air felt unnaturally heavy, suffocating. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I heard slow, deliberate footsteps echoing down the hallway, though I knew without a doubt there was no one there. They were still here. And this time, they didn't need me to wear the glasses to know that I could sense them. One night, as I slept, I felt it. Something was wrong. A crushing weight pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. The air had turned ice cold, like invisible fingers tightening around me. My eyes fluttered open, and I saw it, standing at the edge of my bed. It loomed there, motionless, a grotesque shadow twisted into an unnatural form. Its body was stretched too long, its limbs thin and contorted in ways that defied logic. It had no face, yet I knew it was staring at me. I couldn't move. My body refused to respond, frozen in sheer terror. I wanted to scream, to bolt from my bed, but my throat closed up, my muscles locked in place. Then, it moved. Slowly. Silently. It leaned in closer. A wave of cold dread washed over me. I couldn't tear my gaze away. It was watching me, without eyes. Then a whisper brushed against my ear, soft, yet echoing from an abyss beyond comprehension. "You have seen us." My heart nearly stopped. Did you think you could escape? Suddenly, my entire body felt as if it was being pulled into an endless void. I gasped, jerking upright in bed, chest heaving. The room was silent. Nothing lurked in the shadows. Just a dream? Number, I knew it wasn't just a nightmare. I turned my head toward the desk. The glasses. They were there. I was certain I had thrown them away. I had discarded them, sworn never to wear them again. Yet somehow, they had returned, sitting neatly on my desk as if they had never left. My hands trembled as I reached for them. I didn't want to know what would happen if I put them on again. But I knew one thing. I had no choice. I slipped the glasses back on, and the world shattered. Darkness flooded the room, swallowing everything. I was no longer in my bedroom. I stood in a vast, endless void where faceless shadows roamed. They were no longer standing still. They were moving toward me. I stepped back, but there was nowhere to go. Bony hands reached out, clawing at the air. The whispers came from all directions, repeating the same chilling words. "You have seen us. There is no escape." I screamed. And then, the darkness consumed me. The next morning, my room was found empty. No signs of struggle, no trace of where I had gone. Only one thing remained: a single pair of glasses resting on the desk. And if anyone were foolish enough to put them on, they would see me, standing in the darkness, watching them.